Hey gang, it's Squill. And have you ever had those characters that you absolutely love but just wish the writers would explore them a little more? I have a lot of characters like that, but one of my biggest examples is Fern. Now, I already talked a lot about Fern in my seasons 8 through 10 retrospectives. However, I wanted the opportunity to discuss his arc more in depth, since Fern has a surprising amount of nuance for a character who only appears in a select handful of episodes. But before we get into all that, it's time for a mini history lesson. This is the creation of Fern. Near the end of Season 5, Finn gains the Grass Sword, a cursed sword conjured up by the Grass Wizard. The curse causes the sword to attach itself to Finn's arm. At the start of Season 6, when Finn is trying to stop Martin from abandoning him in the Citadel, the Grass Curse takes over Finn's arm. However, as this is happening, the Star Skipper pulls Finn's arm off, leaving him with just a flower. A few episodes later, Finn is given a new arm thanks to Breezy. However, this arm has a thorn in it, causing the Grass Sword to emerge whenever Finn needs it. Meanwhile, in the episode Is That You, Prismo creates time clones of Finn and Jake. And just to be clear, this is a clone of Finn, as the show specifically states that Fern is not from an alternate timeline. There's this misconception that Fern was pulled from an alternate dimension in which he already existed, and that just isn't the case. Not only does Fern have the exact same memories as Finn, but we know through the Farm World episodes that Prismo is capable of creating new life. Anyways, Finn interacts with his clone, and this paradox causes him to transform into a sword. Most likely due to the fact that it represents Finn's true essence, his heroism. The Finn clone still exists within the sword, however, and is capable of communicating with Finn whenever it pleases. When the Finn sword is stolen by Bandit Princess, Finn accidentally stabs through it using the Grass Sword. This puts the Grass Curse inside the Finn sword, allowing the curse to take control of the Finn clone. This causes the Grass Sword to combine with the Finn sword, thus creating Fern. Okay, so that was a lot of lore I had to explain in order to describe who Fern is and how he came into being. But that's okay, because now we're at the fun part, the analysis. How does Fern change throughout his short time on the show? I think the first interesting thing to note about Fern as a character is how initially antagonistic Finn and Jake were of him. I mean, I guess him wailing on Finn doesn't exactly help. But man, Finn and Jake really tear into him, egging him on to show them his true form. But I think this first scene is effective in establishing his identity crisis that's explored more in the next few episodes. Is Fern just another Finn, or is he his own person? And this concept is explored more in the next episode, Do No Harm. Look at him, so desperately trying to be like Finn. This episode really highlights Fern's lack of maturity when compared to Finn. His black and white view of good versus evil. It's easy to forget sometimes, but Fern hasn't gone through the same character development that Finn has. He hasn't confronted his cosmic destiny or gotten closure with his dad. He hasn't gone through the Hall of Egress or apologized to Flame Princess. Even when you take away the Grass Curse, Fern is still a much less self-actualized version of Finn. And at the end of the episode, he gives himself the name Fern and tries to carve out a new identity for himself. Fern needs this bike. Jumping ahead to Elements, Finn entrusts Fern of taking care of Ooh while he's away. This does not bode well for Fern. Now, this obviously isn't Finn's fault, because he'd have no way of knowing the events of Elements would happen, but man, what a terribly inconvenient time to assign so much responsibility on Fern. It does make me think a bit about that scene in Cloudy. Did Finn subconsciously want Fern to mess up out of fear that he might be better than him? Did Finn set Fern up for failure? This idea isn't really expanded upon anywhere else, but it's certainly interesting to think about. Naturally, the events of Elements had a pretty heavy impact on Fern's arc. Not only did he fail to protect Ooh, but he ended up having to be saved by Finn. And this is not helped at all by the events of Whispers. Fern fails hard at taking care of Sweet Pea. He even ends up getting knocked out by him in the climax. Yikes, my dude. In fact, the only time in which he's actually successful is when he's just copying what Finn would do. At this point, Fern has tried being his own person and being just like Finn, and neither of them have really worked out for him. So the way he sees it, the only real solution is to replace Finn entirely. This leads into Fern's next episode, 3 Buckets. I gotta say, there's something very sinister about Fern's portrayal in the first half of this episode. We get seemingly nice scenes of him and Finn just hanging out, juxtaposed against moments of him acting very strange. This moment here always gets me. The way Fern just stares so coldly back at Finn as he sincerely expresses his emotions. Once Fern traps Finn in the cave, it's clear that the grass curse has taken over, feeding off of his envy for Finn. I quote this scene a lot, but I actually do find it very interesting how Fern claims to be a Neptr guy. I mean, it shows that Fern has great taste. Neptr is very based after all. But I'm sure Fern also relates to Neptr on a certain level, always being left out and neglected. Look, all I'm saying is that the show totally missed out on doing a Fern and Neptr episode. 3 Buckets culminates in a climatic fight scene between Finn and Fern, ending with Fern's supposed death, with Gumball picking up the pieces as the big season finale cliffhanger. That was about the first half of Fern's arc, and overall I'd say it's very solid, with my biggest criticism being that it could have used a couple more episodes. I think there should have been more episodes that Fern is a part of, but isn't the main focus of, giving him a chance to bounce off of other characters. We get a taste of this in The Invitation, but he's such a small part of that episode that it barely amounts to much. It would have been cool to see him join in more on a traditional Finn and Jake adventure, or even interact with more characters who aren't Finn and Jake. That being said, for what little screen time Fern does get, they get some great use out of him. Pretty much all of his appearances advance his arc in some way, which is great. From Two Swords introducing him as a mysterious clone of Finn, to Do No Harm where he realizes that he isn't Finn, to The Invitation where he's trusted with protecting Ooh, to Elements where he fails at that, to Whispers where he tries and fails at doing his own thing, to him just giving up and trying to replace Finn in 3 Buckets. It's a very unique type of identity arc where instead of forging a new identity for himself, he gets corrupted by his envy for the original Finn. And for the most part, I think it's paced very well. Which makes things all the more disappointing when Season 10 kinda drops the ball with Fern. On a pure conceptual level, I love what they do with Fern in Season 10. Him joining Gumball's family and claiming a new identity as the Green Knight had so much potential that the show unfortunately didn't utilize. We don't really get to see much of this new dynamic at all. We never get to see what Fern's relationship with Gumball is like. So when Gumball betrays Fern and Come Along With Me, it just doesn't leave much of an impact. Fern's relationship with Gumball could have been a great parallel to Finn's relationship with PB. We could have seen Gumball assign missions for Fern to go on that conflict with Finn or PB. Or hell, he could have gotten his own Jake. There were a lot of interesting places they could have gone with Fern that unfortunately the show didn't get to explore. On the bright side, I do think his redemption in Come Along With Me mostly works. Him confronting his shared trauma with Finn and taking out the grass curse is a solid ending to his arc. It just all feels a little quick, considering just how much is crammed into the episode. I love Come Along With Me, but it's a bit of a mess. But none of that can take away from just how hard Fern's death scene goes. Such a beautifully melancholic ending for such a tormented character. It's great that the show let him go out in peace and on his own terms. Although I've always wondered about this little seed he leaves behind. I'm sure it still contains some essence of Fern's spirit, but does Fern himself still live within the new Finn sword like he did the old one? And if so, does he still have the same memories? I've always kind of liked the idea of a version of Finn still existing within the sword and being able to guide Shermie and Beth on adventures. Especially if you believe in the theory that Shermie and Beth are reincarnations of Finn and Jake. Despite my mixed thoughts on how the show handled him as a whole, Fern is still one of my all-time favorite Adventure Time characters. I admit, his design definitely does a lot of the heavy lifting. He's one of the coolest looking characters in the series in my opinion. But I've also just always had a soft spot for seeing alternate versions of characters we're familiar with. What Finn could have been like under different circumstances. He has a lot of the same appeal as a character like Lake from Infinity Train or Hunter from The Owl House, albeit with a much darker arc. I'll always wish the show did more to flesh out his dynamic with Gumball. As I've said, there was a lot of missed potential there. But for a character who's only in a small handful of episodes, they really did do a lot with him. Please let me know how you feel about Fern in the comments. Have a good one, and Squill out.